A shy girl visits a gynecologist, shockingly. Her doctor is a young millionaire fall deeply in love with her. Sophie Bennett's hands trembled as she clutched the clipboard, her fingers tightening around the pen. The waiting room of Hayes Women's Health Clinic was pristine and modern, but no amount of soft lighting or calming music could ease the anxiety twisting in her stomach. She hated being here. Her heart pounded as she scanned the intake form in front of her. Name, date of birth, medical history, simple questions, but her mind felt like a jumbled mess. She wiped her clammy hands on her jeans and forced herself to focus. Just fill out the form, Sophie. It's not that hard. But it was hard. She had spent her whole life avoiding this moment, convincing herself she didn't need to see a gynecologist. But after weeks of discomfort and late-night Google searches that only fueled her worst fears, she had finally caved. The receptionist had highly recommended Dr. Daniel Hayes, one of the best in the city. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. To her, a doctor was just a doctor. Old, serious professional. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. A nurse stepped into the waiting room, holding a file. "Sophie Bennett?" "Night." Sophie nearly jumped. She swallowed hard, gripping her form like it was a lifeline. With wobbly legs, she stood and followed the nurse down a hallway. Her stomach churned as she passed closed exam rooms, the scent of antiseptic filling the air. "You can have a seat," the nurse said with a polite smile, gesturing to a chair inside the doctor's office. "Dr. Hayes will be in shortly." Sophie nodded, but she could barely breathe. She sat down stiffly, her back straight as a ruler, her hands clasped in her lap. The room was neat. Framed certificates lined the walls. A sleek desk sat in the corner, and beside it, the exam chair loomed like something out of a horror movie. She tried not to stare at it. Her fingers twisted together anxiously as she rehearsed what she would say. Be calm. Be normal. Get through this. And that was when Sophie forgot how to breathe altogether. The man who stepped inside was not the kind of doctor she had pictured in her head. Dr. Daniel Hayes was gorgeous. Tall, broad-shouldered, effortlessly handsome. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his jaw was sharp enough to cut glass, and his deep blue eyes held an easy confidence. He was not supposed to look like this. Sophie's mouth went dry. "Miss Bennett?" His voice was smooth, calm, completely professional. He gave her a reassuring smile as he shut the door behind him. Sophie tried to answer, but nothing came out. She was too busy panicking. He was young. He was attractive. He was going to examine her. Oh no. Daniel sat down across from her, flipping through her file. "I see this is your first visit to a gynecologist." Sophie nodded so quickly she might have given herself whiplash. Daniel's smile remained gentle. "I know this can be nerve-wracking, but I promise we'll take things at your pace. Nothing happens unless you're comfortable." She nodded again, cheeks burning. Daniel noticed the way she tensed, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she looked like she wanted to disappear into the chair. She was different from most patients he saw, shy, timid, fragile in a way that made something in him stir. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softer. "How are you feeling?" Sophie clenched her hands together. "Fine," she lied. Daniel chuckled, a warm, easy sound. "You don't have to be nervous." "I promise. I'm not that scary." Sophie begged to differ. He was terrifying, not because of who he was, but because of what he was making her feel. She had never reacted to anyone like this before, her heart racing, her palms sweating, her body hyper-aware of his every move. And the worst part? Daniel noticed. Her body language. The way she avoided his gaze. The pink flush on her cheeks. She was adorable. Daniel had met thousands of patients, confident ones, nervous ones, even some who flirted shamelessly. But Sophie was different. Her vulnerability made him want to be careful with her. He had never been the type to mix emotions with work, but something about the way she looked at him, wide-eyed and hesitant, made him want to protect her. And that was a dangerous thought. He cleared his throat, pushing those feelings aside. "Focus, Daniel. You're her doctor, not some guy in a bar." "Before we begin," he said, keeping his voice light, "do you have any questions for me?" Sophie hesitated. She had a million questions, but every single one died in her throat. So she just shook her head. Daniel's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if trying to decode her silence. Then he smiled again. "All right, let's get started." And Sophie knew, without a doubt, this was going to be the longest appointment of her life. Sophie practically sprinted out of the clinic that day. Her heart was still pounding as she walked down the busy sidewalk, her hands clammy, her cheeks still burning from embarrassment. She had never felt so out of place in her entire life. Dr. Daniel Hayes was too much. Too handsome, too charming, too intimidating. And the worst part, he had been kind, gentle, understanding, which somehow made things worse. Because that meant she couldn't even be mad at him. She was mad at herself. Mad at the way her stomach had flipped when he spoke to her. Mad at the way her skin tingled when he reached out to shake her hand. Mad at the way she had nearly melted into a puddle on the floor just from looking at him. She could never go back. Not in a million years. But fate, as always, had other plans. For the next 2 weeks, Sophie ignored every call from the clinic. Her prescription needed to be adjusted. Didn't care. She needed to schedule a follow-up. Not happening. But then her symptoms started getting worse, and no amount of avoiding the problem was going to make it go away, which was how she found herself back in that same waiting room, gripping the arms of the chair like it was a lifeline. This time she silently prayed that maybe she'd get a different doctor. Someone older, someone boring, someone who wouldn't make her entire brain short-circuit. But of course, life hated her. Because the moment the nurse called her name and led her back to the office, the person waiting for her was, once again, him, Dr. Daniel Hayes, looking as unfairly good as ever. He looked up from his file when she stepped in, and then he smiled. "Sophie," he said, closing the folder. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." Her breath hitched. He noticed. Her stomach twisted as she quickly took a seat, keeping her gaze glued to the floor. I wasn't," she stammered, lying through her teeth. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk. His expression was gentle, amused, but also curious. "You missed your follow-up," he said. "And when we tried calling, you didn't answer." Sophie felt like she was dying. I got busy," she mumbled. Daniel didn't believe her for a second, but he let it slide. Instead, he studied her carefully, noticing the way she kept fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve, the way her shoulders were tense, stiff. She was nervous. She had been nervous last time, too. And somehow, knowing that made something inside him soften. He had seen thousands of patients, but none like Sophie Bennett. There was something about her, something delicate, something that made him want to be careful, to move slowly, to make sure she felt safe. And that was a strange feeling. A feeling he hadn't expected. Sophie, meanwhile, was trying not to pass out. Every second in this room felt like torture. She knew he was just doing his job, that he wasn't thinking about this the way she was, but it didn't matter. She had to get out of here as soon as possible. So the moment the appointment ended, she practically ran for the door, mumbling a thank you as she disappeared down the hall. And Daniel, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, felt a pang of disappointment as he watched her go. He didn't expect to see her again so soon. Not outside the clinic. Not in a completely different setting. But a few days later, as he stepped into his favorite cafe to grab a coffee before heading to work, his eyes landed on a familiar figure sitting by the window, curled up with a book. Sophie. She hadn't seen him yet. She was focused on the novel in front of her, occasionally tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, biting her lip in concentration. She looked peaceful here, different, not the bundle of nerves she had been in his office. And for some reason, that made Daniel hesitate. Because suddenly she wasn't just a patient. She was someone he wanted to know, not just in a medical setting, not just as a name on a file, but as a person, as Sophie. He took a deep breath and walked over. "Fancy seeing you here," he said, leaning slightly against the table. Sophie froze mid-sip, her eyes going wide as she looked up. For a moment, she just stared at him, like her brain was still processing what was happening. Then, she choked on her coffee. Daniel tried not to laugh. Sophie wanted to die. Because for the second time in a row, Dr. Daniel Hayes had completely caught her off guard. Sophie gripped her coffee cup tightly, her heart still racing from the surprise of seeing Dr. Daniel Hayes outside his clinic. She had barely recovered from her embarrassment, and now here he was, standing in front of her, impossibly composed, his sharp blue eyes glinting with amusement. Hi, she stammered, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Daniel chuckled, sliding into the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. "I had no idea you came here," he said, glancing around the cafe. "This is my usual spot." Sophie swallowed hard, trying not to panic. This was not where she expected to see him again, outside of a medical setting, just casually sitting across from her, like this was normal. I like the quiet," she mumbled, hoping he wouldn't notice how nervous she was. Daniel smiled. "Me too." And just like that, an easy silence settled between them. For the first time, Sophie allowed herself to actually look at him, really look at him. He was wearing a tailored dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms. His watch looked expensive, his entire presence effortlessly polished, exuding wealth and confidence. He looked like someone who belonged to a completely different world than hers. And yet, here he was, sitting across from her, looking at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. That thought terrified her. A few days later, Sophie's world shifted again. She was absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone when she stumbled upon an article, and her stomach dropped. Dr. Daniel Hayes, the millionaire doctor behind Hayes Medical Group. She froze. Heart pounding, she clicked on the article, her eyes widening with every word. Daniel wasn't just a doctor. He was the doctor. A leading name in gynecology, a pioneer in women's health, with multiple hospitals under his name, including the very clinic she had visited. And on top of that, he was filthy rich. Sophie could barely breathe. It wasn't just that he was successful. It was the fact that she had been so naive. She had let herself believe, for even a second, that he was just a normal person. But now, the truth was staring her right in the face. Daniel Hayes wasn't just some charming doctor. He was untouchable. And she was just Sophie Bennett, an ordinary girl with an ordinary life, struggling to pay her rent, trying to figure things out one day at a time. They weren't equals. They weren't even close. And the sooner she accepted that, the better. Daniel started noticing the change immediately. Sophie was avoiding him. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But then she started ignoring his texts, stopped coming to the cafe, stopped showing up for follow-up appointments. And suddenly, he realized he might actually lose her before he even had a chance to figure out what this was. That was unacceptable. So one evening, he found her. Sophie had just finished her shift at the bookstore where she worked, her bag slung over her shoulder as she stepped onto the sidewalk. And then, he was there, leaning against his sleek black car, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her. Sophie's heart leaped into her throat. "Daniel?" she croaked. His gaze never wavered. "Are you avoiding me?" His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something she had never heard before. Sophie looked away. "No, I've just been busy." Daniel exhaled, stepping closer. "Sophie," he said, voice quieter now, "don't lie to me." She clenched her fists. "Why does it matter?" she asked. You're you. And I'm me. We're from completely different worlds, Daniel. And she swallowed hard. I don't want to be someone people think is chasing after you for your money." Daniel stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. But it was genuine disbelief. Sophie felt her cheeks heat. "Why are you laughing?" Daniel shook his head, his expression softening. "Because, Sophie," he murmured, "I think you're the first person in my life who's ever run away from me because of my money." Sophie's lips parted, but she had no words. Because for the first time she saw it. The exhaustion in his eyes. The way he looked at her, not as a doctor, not as a millionaire, but as a man who was simply trying to understand her. And, suddenly, she wasn't so sure about running anymore. Sophie tried everything to keep her distance from Daniel. She avoided the cafe. She turned down his invitations, politely at first, then more firmly. She ignored the texts he sent checking up on her, even though each one made her heart ache with guilt. But no matter how hard she tried to shut him out, there was one thing she couldn't ignore: herself. Because every time she saw his name flash across her phone, her fingers itched to respond. Because every time she walked past the clinic, she had to force herself not to look inside. Because every time she closed her eyes at night, she saw his face, heard his voice, felt the warmth of his presence. And that terrified her. Because Daniel Hayes wasn't just someone she could fall for. He was someone she could lose herself in. And that was even scarier than the idea of him walking away. So Sophie did the only thing she knew how to do. She ran. But Daniel didn't give up so easily. At first, he gave her space. He let her have time to process, to come to terms with whatever this was between them. But when the days stretched into weeks, and Sophie still refused to let him in, he knew he had to do something.
So he stopped chasing her. And instead, he simply showed up. Not in a grand, dramatic way, but in small moments. At the bookstore where she worked, where he would occasionally drop by, pretending to browse while striking up casual conversation. At the cafe where he would sit in his usual spot, a quiet presence in her periphery, never pushing, just being there. And slowly, it worked. Because Sophie stopped avoiding him. She stopped making excuses. And one day she even found herself laughing at something he said, a real, genuine laugh. And for the first time in weeks, Daniel saw a crack in her walls. But just as Sophie was starting to feel comfortable, starting to think that maybe this wasn't as impossible as she thought, something happened that changed everything. It was late. She had stayed at work longer than usual, her head pounding, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. She hadn't been feeling well all day, but she pushed through it, telling herself it was just a little fatigue, that she would be fine once she got home. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the world tilted. Her vision blurred. Her knees buckled. And then, everything went black. The next thing she knew, she was somewhere warm. Soft sheets beneath her, the steady beep of a monitor in the background. Slowly, she opened her eyes, only to be met with the last person she expected to see. Daniel. Sitting beside her bed in the hospital, his elbows resting on his knees, his face drawn with worry. The moment he saw her awake, he exhaled sharply, relief flooding his features. "Sophie," he murmured, "you scared the hell out of me." Her throat was dry. What happened?" "You collapsed on the street," he said, voice tight. "A passerby called an ambulance. When I found out you were here, he swallowed hard. I came as fast as I could." Sophie blinked slowly, trying to process his words. He came for her. He had dropped everything for her. And suddenly, all the walls she had built, all the reasons she had convinced herself to stay away from him, they didn't matter anymore. Sophie woke up to the soft glow of hospital lights and the distant murmur of voices outside the room. Her body felt heavy, her limbs weak, but it was the warmth beside her that made her turn her head. And that was when she saw him. Daniel. Sitting next to her bed, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. His usually sharp, confident features were drawn with exhaustion and concern, his dark hair slightly tousled, as if he had been running his hands through it. The moment her eyes fluttered open, he exhaled sharply, relief flooding his face. "Sophie." His voice was low, raw. "You scared the hell out of me." Sophie blinked slowly, her mind still catching up. What happened?" Her throat was dry, her voice weak. Daniel leaned in slightly, as if needing to be closer. "You collapsed on the street." His fingers curled into a fist. "You had a high fever. You were dehydrated, exhausted, pushing yourself too hard." Sophie swallowed, trying to sit up, but he was immediately there, his hands steadying her, supporting her. And for the first time she saw it. Not pity. Not responsibility. But something else entirely. Something gentle. Intense. Unwavering. Genuine care. Her chest tightened painfully. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't look at her like that. Because if he did, she might start to believe it. She might start to believe that someone like him, someone who had everything, could actually want someone like her. And she couldn't afford that kind of heartbreak. So she did what she always did. She pushed him away. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's brows furrowed. "What?" Sophie forced herself to look away. "You don't have to do this." His jaw clenched. "Do what?" "This," she gestured weakly around the room, "taking care of me, sitting here all night, acting like I matter." Daniel's entire body went still. And then, his expression darkened. "Sophie," he said, his voice suddenly low and sharp, "you think I'm here out of obligation?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because yes, that's exactly what she thought. And that thought terrified her. She didn't want to be his burden. She didn't want to be the girl he felt sorry for. So she forced herself to say it. "I don't need your charity, Daniel." His eyes flashed with something she had never seen before, frustration, anger, something deeper. "This isn't charity, Sophie," he said, voice tight. "This is me caring about you." She let out a short, breathless laugh. "Why?" Daniel's fingers curled at his sides. "What do you mean, why?" "Why me?" she whispered. "You have everything. Money, success. Women who would do anything to be with you." Her throat tightened. "So why are you here?" His breath hitched. And then, he finally said it. "Because I like you, Sophie." Sophie's heart stopped. The words hung between them, heavy, impossible to ignore. But before she could even process it, before she could let herself believe it, the fear took over again. She shook her head, her fingers gripping the hospital blanket. "No," she said, her voice barely holding together. "That doesn't make sense." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Why not?" Sophie swallowed hard, her chest aching. "Because," she whispered, "you have everything, and I have nothing." Her voice trembled. "So, how am I supposed to believe that you actually need me?"